Bien, mes amis, si vous pouvez vous asseoir, ceux qui sont...
So, dear friends, if you could please take your seats for those of you who are still standing. One remark, first of all, as there are a lot of you here, there is a broadcast in Amphitheatre 2, which is already underway. So, first test session can be followed in Amphitheatre. So, as everything has to be ready for later on, and we have our timekeeper here, I'd like to tell you one or two very simple things. First of all, welcome. We already said that this morning, we weren't all here this morning. So it's important for you to know that these meetings, these rencontres are organized by the Rencontres Economiques and the President François Benamou, and named the whole team that organized this event. For those of you who weren't here previously, I'd like to wish a really warm welcome, and especially I'd like to say that you are here to work. It's difficult during the weekend, of course, but you're here to work because we are going to start a new session about renewing hope, and the aim is to recreate hope and renew hope. And so during these 2.5 days, we're going to try to focus on that theme. I often say that this is an exceptional year. I said it this morning. Everybody thinks that I'm talking rubbish. It's not true at all. This year is an exceptional year for 4 reasons. The first reason is the number of people who have asked to register, 30% more, 7,000 people have asked to register. Well, a round of applause if you like, yes, certainly. Especially as you're applauding yourselves, which is nice. And about 500,000 and 1 million people are following us now at a particular time on internet. The first remark. The second remark is a theme that's been chosen by our team who's organizing this event and defined the program, the particular head, Marlene Joubert. This theme is a very, very positive theme, a rather dangerous theme. When we talk about renewing hope, it's not easy, especially during the current period. And the aim of this was to both situate ourselves in this particular period of time with a very optimistic discourse, but also to broaden the sometimes rather limited scope of economists to all of the other possible other disciplines we can imagine. And this morning you had in the session, the inaugural session, for those of you who were there, you had the illustration of that because we were talking about human rights, Amnesty International, etc. We're talking about a version which is much broader than just talking about the changes in interest rates. The third remark, sorry. There is, we're going to talk about young people a lot of, I'm not talking about myself, unfortunately, of course, but during these 2.5 days, we will be focusing a great deal on themes to do with youth and young people, and especially on Sunday, there will be 2 sessions to illustrate and highlight the work that has been carried out with 35,000 young people who asked various questions, and we had a discussion with them. And in reality, they expressed a lot of different wishes, and we've highlighted 5 of these wishes or proposals, which will be the subject of discussion on Sunday morning. And in the same way as we started by saying that in the world of violence, how can we maintain hope? The last session, which will take place around François Benamou, the last session will be with the participation of 4 young people. When I say young, I have to point that out because my idea of youth is a bit broader than other people's. They're aged below 35, so they're very young indeed. And they're going to redefine hope and renewing hope. I know I only had 2 minutes, but it doesn't really matter. So the last thing, which is very important, is that in our country and in Europe too, we are experiencing a world that is very tense, very under a lot of pressure, a lot of tension between different groups in society, between the generations, between young and old. All of that is very characteristic of France, where we had 1 million people demonstrating for the retirement pension, and then we've had a lot of fighting and difficulties in the cities in France as well. All of this demonstrates that we need proposals that are calming, that are subjects for discussion between each one of us. The evolution of French society and European society, and here I'm turning to Charles Michel, who gives us a great honor of being us, is of course the fact that we can have a dialogue, and he knows this much better than I do, have a dialogue between the different community groups and intergenerational groups, and countries can talk to each other. They tend to be rather tense, and this can be difficult in Europe as well, and Charles Michel is very good at having a peaceful discussion, just like a Christmas fairy tale, almost like a Christmas fairy tale. You can give him a round of applause later on if you like. And in that respect, the members of the Circle of Economists, we always issue a declaration which takes up 4 or 5 points we see as recommendations or principles we want to propose to politicians. Needless to say, over the 23 years, Philippe Paiguillon was reminding me that in 2 cases we had an impact, the CICE and IESF. They had an impact on those 2 organizations. But all of the others have not had any impact because the Cercle of Economists leaves most people rather indifferent. So we have decided to change and to involve all of you without any exception. Every single one of you, you're going to participate in an operation called the Manifesto. What is a manifesto? This means that we have a text that a lot of people can agree on. It talks about youth, about the excluded. It talks about the idea that we have a level of activity of older people that is greater than it is now. It talks about the fact that public expenditure could be dealt with in a different way, etc., etc. I won't give you a description of all of them, but the idea is that at the end of these 2.5 days, we'll be able to say that the immense majority of the businesses who are our partners, without mentioning them by name, they agree on this subject. This is a case today for a little more than half, that thousands of people will say, yes, we need to add it, but your manifesto is the right way to go. So if this manifesto is has a large enough scale, it will carry on for another 2.5 months. It's just as a way of saying, this is of conveying a message in the name of the Rencontres Economiques of Aix-en-Provence, which represents some thousands of people, and we can say to our politicians, to people who have to think about the future, and to different parliamentarians, we can say to them, here are some measures for engagement and involvement that we want to take together. I know that you all agree, and I now suggest, before I hand over to my friend and the whole team who is here, I don't want you to applaud me. I want you to applaud the idea of the manifesto. Long live the manifesto. This is the manifesto will impose itself. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very honored to moderate this session, the inaugural session of the Rencontres Economiques Aix-en-Provence, which is a very promising theme of renewing hope, whereas in Europe, as we will see, Europe has been able to withstand the tremors of the war in Ukraine, which has modified the balances in terms of energy, the economy and strategy. I would like to introduce to you the people who will be participating in this debate. First of all, and by video conference from Tbilisi, we have the President of the Republic of Georgia, Salomé Zourabichvili. Thank you for being with us. Hello. I'm sorry I cannot be with you physically. Thank you for being here. Then in Aix, we have with us Helle Thorning Schmidt. Good afternoon. You're the former Prime Minister of Denmark. We have Michel next to you, President of the European Council. And then we have Philippe Martin, a member of the Cercle des Économistes, the Dean of the Public Affairs Institute at Political Science of Aix-en-Provence. And so, Philippe, you're going to give us the framework for our discussion now. Thank you, Isabel. I think what strikes me when I look at the situation, and particularly what has happened over the last 2 years, and I think this resonates with the theme of this session and the theme of the Rencontre this year, is resilience. Resilience of our societies, of our governments, and of our economies. I'm an economist, so of course I will emphasize the economic dimension, but I'm sure we will also talk about the political dimension as well. Resilience of our economies after the unique shocks in terms of their impact and scale, the COVID and then the war in Ukraine. And in particular, I'm thinking of what happened with the invasion by Russia of Ukraine. I'm thinking of the energy crisis that resulted from it. What strikes me is that the Cassandras, the bringers of bad news, were wrong. We had this debate, you may remember, about a year ago, about what was going to happen if we had a strong reduction or even a complete stoppage of imports of gas and oil coming from Russia. And I remember that the forecasts were pretty doom-laden. We were told there would be a very strong recession, and in the manufacturing sector in particular, the figures were put forward of -5 or -8%. We know this didn't happen, and so we know that although there was no embargo by the European Union, we had the figures from Eurostat a few days ago about the reduction in imports of gas and oil. We're not down to zero, but it's virtually that, and it's well, the figures are much, much lower, and the imports are extremely small. So this is a shock which is completely unheard of before and quite unique. If we're looking at the manufacturing sector, for France, for example, the prices of gas have virtually doubled on average, with a lot of heterogeneity depending on the different sectors. The most intensive industries in terms of use of electricity have seen a bigger increase in cost. And in other cases, it's been an increase of 40%. What strikes me is the capacity, and this is true, I think we'll talk about the states as well, the capacity of the households and of the capacity of businesses to adapt to this new situation. And they've adapted to that quickly, very quickly and very radically in different ways. If we look at the businesses and companies, what's happened from the point of view of an economist is quite good news. It means that the price signal has worked. In other words, they reduced the demand of gas and of electricity, and as we could have feared, this didn't lead to a reduction in production. If you reduce energy demand by closing down factories, some of the factories stopped, but from a macroeconomic point of view, from an aggregated point of view, what we see, in fact, there's an increase in energy efficiency. The companies have been able to find the means to adapt to this energy shock They have also increased their manufacturing prices, which is a good news for them because it's one of the reasons why, of course, the profits have not collapsed. Except for the most energy-intensive industries, this is not such good news for the inflation dynamic. This means that inflation has spread throughout the value chains. They have also not reduced very much the number of jobs and their production level. However, and this is a discussion we need to have, what we have seen is that quite clearly the high energy cost has had an impact on competitiveness, and particularly in relation to China and the United States. And of course, this is one of the major challenges in terms of the sustainability of this resilience we were talking about. I'll end. I know I'm only supposed to talk about hope, but nevertheless, I'd like to mention a few risks. I can see a few. In general, we've seen this in the crisis. The economies and businesses in general, when they're faced with this kind of shock, they adapt and they are resilient. What we also need to see is that quite often in the history of economics, the problem isn't the shock, it's the mistakes that are made in the economic response to the shock. And I think where there is a risk is, and I don't want to pinpoint one particular institution, but it is a monetary response. We know who you're talking about. I'm not going to tell you, of course, about the European Central Bank, of course. I can understand, and we'll have this debate about the increase in interest rates. I think there is a risk of an overreaction to the initial shock. And I think their job is a very difficult one. So there could be mistakes on both sides. So I think that is one of the risks that I wanted to mention for the resilience of the European economy, which, of course, has repercussions above and beyond the economy on the social aspects and the politics, of course, and I'm thinking in particular of the European elections next year. Thank you.
So first question is about resilience, economic resilience. The economies haven't collapsed. But what about this resilience? Is it sustainable or is it flimsy? Mrs. Zourabichvili, what is your take on that? What do you think of that? What do you think of resilience? What about the economies and countries? How do they go about that resilience? So I do share the observations that have been made. And of course, we haven't anticipated such a situation. So Europe was not divided. And Europe hasn't burst out following the war, both from an economic viewpoint and social viewpoint. And in The Guardian, the German Minister of Economics has said that the energy situation has changed and the military situation has changed. And Germany has supported Ukraine, and the war in Ukraine urged Germany to take a different approach to the outside world. So for us, we are geared towards Europe. We expect a lot from Europe. So it means that hope has been revived, has been renewed. Europe is different. It is united now, and with a lot of foresight. So Europe has discovered what Russia was, what Russian imperialism was, and Europe is facing the threat of Russia. Whereas in the past, the perception about Russia was rather positive. It was no longer the case with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And of course, Europe is united and never ever would put enough thought that Europe would have been able to weather the storms. So it is said that next winter will be more difficult, but Europe has already demonstrated that it managed to hold good. And Europe is now more powerful than in the past. We were expecting this Europe of defense, and this is quite significant, important. What is pivotal is to present a united front. This is what Europe has done for us. We have lots of expectations vis-à-vis Europe, and that's very important in terms of our approach. Moreover, for Georgia, Georgia is outside Europe, but Georgia managed to weather the storm of the economic pressure. We are facing a different type of economic pressure. Economic resilience is connected with the immigration of Russians who brought currencies and a kind of new market. And this is relatively dangerous, because if it vanishes into thin air, it means that we depend on them. So it's a new form of dependence, and we need to pay attention to that. This is one of the risks that we're facing. For Georgia, 20% of the country is occupied by Russia, and we had a war against Russia in 2008. So there's a lot of pressure upon us by Russia. So European resilience is very important to us. It gives us a lot of hope. So we hope that we will be able to make headway. What is important is European being anchored to Europe. We have a status of candidate. So Russia is losing the war in Ukraine and has decided to export the war to Georgia in a hybrid fashion. Thanks a lot. President, so Georgia being a candidate to the EU. So the floor is yours. Helle, Thorning, Schmidt, former Prime Minister of Denmark. Do you think that Europe is stronger, is more consolidated, that the energy crisis is behind us, or any signs of vigilance that we need to look at today? Sorry, I don't speak French well.
I'll try to speak slowly. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's an amazing day. When we talk about the energy crisis today, you do wish for the days where we had to have 19 degrees in all public spaces, but not so much today. It's great to be here, and we are at a pivotal moment for Europe. Europe has found itself closer together than ever. I've been working in European politics for more than 3 decades, and I've never seen such resolve from the European countries. Resolve to tackle what comes at us from the all-out invasion of Ukraine. Resolve on the energy crisis, on the economic crisis, but also in new regulation regarding climate change, and digital services and the whole digital space. I also see a new kind of resolve in terms of how we will position us globally. And Europe is trying right now very hard to find a way to position us in terms of China, discussing at our European summits whether we should follow the Americans in their very hostile approach to China, or find our own way in terms of China. So that's another big issue. The other big issue is, of course, in terms of digital development. I sit on the Meta Oversight Board very close to content moderation, and I do think that Europe is trying to find its way in that area as well. And then the last D, democracy. Europe is still a beacon of democracy in a world where fewer and fewer people are living in democracies. And that's why we have to be very serious about how we develop our democracy, how we understand our position globally in terms of our democracy. But I don't think that Europe has ever faced as many challenges And at the same time, and that's a hope for all of us, with all the negative challenges that we're facing, we haven't seen a Europe so united as we're seeing in these years as well.
So, Charles Michel, the President of the European Council, do you agree with that? Do you concur with the former Prime Minister of Denmark? Do you think that Europe is more united than ever? So, good afternoon to all of you. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you this afternoon. Salomé, Zourabichvili, so hello to you. So, the former Prime Minister of Denmark came up with relevant observations, and I do share the diagnosis. The EU, this is a project with three promises in mind. Following the rubble of disasters, the values, so respect for human life, respect for freedom, respect for principles based on democracy. The second promise is peace and security, and the third promise is prosperity. And these are three commitments, and they are intertwined. So if you take a step back before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, if you look at the situation before that war, these values, these promises were under pressure. The economic model is changing, digital transition, climate transition. There's a new paradigm shift, and we need to adapt ourselves. We need to change. We need to change the way we produce, the way we consume. We need to have a different approach to the way we relate to people. With COVID, it was a shock, and the world was upside down. And there were lots of things that were taken for granted, and there's a third element. In addition to that, a war on the European continent. In France, following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, there was a summit, the summit of Versailles. So the 27 heads of state and government discussed a treaty change, but they developed the concept of strategic autonomy of the EU. Without changing the treaty, it's a matter of saying that we'll be working together as Europeans, and this is what we did. So what are the 4 points? What are the 4 pillars? I think that they're absolutely pivotal, and they will gain ground in the future. So economics, back to the industry, the ability to produce in Europe and to further the economic strategy. We took into account the capital markets. We are too slow. We need to mobilize economic fuel within the economies. This will be pivotal. So economic base, industrial base, prosperity, we can make the link. Second element, security and defense. For quite a long time, Europe has been a project based on values. That is great. A project based on economic partnership, prosperity, a partnership with the euro that makes it possible to stabilize our economic development. But let us be honest altogether, but it was not a security-based project. European defense has turned out to be something tangible. Following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the heads of state and government decided to deliver and supply weapons to Ukraine. It was the birth of European defense, and we need to go even further. And of course, we trained Ukrainian soldiers, and we provide and supply ammunition. And I hope that France and Germany will shoulder their responsibilities. Third point, you've talked about it already. Regarding energy, we changed the situation. We depended quite a lot on fossil fuel from Russia, from 40% to 10%, because we wanted to implement a plan, a blueprint, in order to move away from the Russian dependence, but we are over-dependent on many other countries. So in other sectors, we have to be very attentive. For example, we are too dependent on China, so we shouldn't reproduce the errors and mistakes that were made in the past, especially with Russia. So commitment with the rest of the world. So we believe in a powerful Europe. So I think that we need to look ourselves in a mirror, but we need to look at the world and how the world perceives us. We are a continent with freedom, but from time to time we have to be more humble in terms of partnerships. So we need to pay heed to this message. We should be mobilized for a multipolar world, because there's a big danger with the war by Russia. There's an attempt to consider the world as being binary. So the EU has a role to play to build a multipolar world. So this does imply a lot of work. Unity is key. European unity is not spontaneous. It's a matter of listening to people, mutual respect. People need to understand one another. We have different traditions, we have different stories, different histories, different political parties. Of course, this may have an impact. And of course, we need to pay a sympathetic ear to the different countries in Europe. And these are promises: peace, prosperity, security, values. Our generation should be up to the task for the future generations. This is what Europe is all about. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Charles Michel. So you've just talked about that, European unity, a land of prosperity, a land of economic resilience. It's not always easy to strike a good balance, especially when you have 27 countries. Philippe Martin, you are an economist, so what is your take on that? So for you, if you consider the economic approaches and strategies that are implemented by the different countries, and the most powerful ones, any harbinger of rifts within the European Union, whereby the European Union unity might be challenged. There are lots of threats to European cohesion, but as Charles Michel said, there are lots of divergences and differences within Europe. It's not always easy. It has never been a bed of roses, but if you consider the situation, we are at a pivotal moment. If you consider Europe, if you consider the way Europe perceives itself vis-à-vis the rest of the world as an economic power, is a paradigm shift. When you change so quickly, when there's a paradigm shift that occurs quite swiftly, countries will develop themselves at a different pace. That's why there are differing views. Two things that I would like to highlight. Climate change. Of course, this might not be an economist viewpoint, but in France, in Germany, in Italy, in other countries as well, we are at a pivotal moment. And I might oversimplify, but a few months ago in France, Emmanuel Macron, the President of the Republic, and the government, they haven't done enough in terms of climate change. We have to be faster. We have to take more robust measures. But there's a paradigm shift. And there's a change. This is something that we've witnessed in Germany. We are doing too much. We are too fast. We are too swift. You have to take into account tax regulations, and tax regulations, they do not come down well in the minds of politicians and people. There will be European elections next year, so I think that we are at a crucial moment. We are at a watershed regarding climate change or climate-related issues. There are tough debates. The EU, Europe, was founded with prosperity in mind. Of course, the single market was created, and maybe we haven't gone further with the single market. But Europe was eager to open itself to the world. And I think that the EU has signed the highest number of trade agreements with a lot of integration with China. So it means that with China, we are too dependent, and that's dangerous. Of course, prosperity means being open-minded, trade-wise. Regarding the industry, we need to be more open, but we have to be cautious regarding our practices. There are some short-term climate goals to achieve, and it would mean importing electric vehicles, heat pumps, solar panels from China. So if you consider these three goals, these goals are contradictory, and the EU will have to remove one of the two objectives or to revisit one of the three objectives. And I think that in so doing will make a difference. So to what extent the EU is opened? So this is a question for you, Mrs. Zourabichvili, because Georgie would like to join the EU. So here at Aix-en-Provence, what do you think of these discussions? Aren't they ancillary? Europe, for you, is synonymous with security today, belonging to the EU.
Belonging to the European Union is a question of security, of course. It's also the common values. It's also prosperity and the social rules that change society, that make it possible to adapt and modernize society. I think the renewed hope is the hope for enlargement of Europe, which was something that had stopped at a particular time. And so if Europe stops enlarging and no longer meets its own defends its own interests at its borders, it's a Europe that will be closed in on itself and will be less dynamic. So to a certain extent, we are your new border, because we can see that the European Union and NATO are each organizing themselves so that they can have a strategy for the Black Sea, which has to be a sea representing security. When we saw the war in Ukraine and the effect that this war can have on the Black Sea itself in terms of security and also in terms of export of wheat and grains. President Zelensky is in Turkey today to talk about this, but also because we have seen Russian mines floating in the Black Sea, which have threatened Romania and Bulgaria. So this Black Sea is very important, and it's a sea that today has entered the European space. Past that we have the Caucasian space, and after that we have Georgia. But we have to what happens to Georgia is extremely important, because for Georgia Europe is a model, and here I should add that the Rencontres that Michel will be organizing soon with our Armenian and Azerbaijan neighbors. Europe is acting as a torchbearer, which Russia has been trying to control up to now, and this is why peace has become more and more remote, as Russia was claiming to try to resolve the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So this is very good news that the European Union is becoming involved and organize these meetings. And it's very good news that after the surveillance mission of the line of occupation in Georgia, that there is now a mission by the European Union in Armenia, which is also monitoring the situation and securing the border. These are things that nobody could have imagined a few years ago, that European soldiers, although They're not playing a military role. They are carrying out maintenance and monitoring. It's unimaginable they would have been in Caucasia. And so all of the countries in the area are looking towards Europe because there are a lot of energy reserves in our countries. For example, the connectivity cable that we want to have from us to Europe through the Black Sea. The countries in Central Asia are starting to think about having a cable under the Caspian Sea as well. All of this is taking place on the borders of Europe, and it will become the new border of democracy, which we hope will be stabilized. It would also be a new border. I hope that that the war in Ukraine and this war that is being won by Ukraine because Russia is not able to win it over the last year and a half, our hope is to see Europe rebuilt without any totalitarian regimes, without any occupied zones within Europe. Thank you, President. Charles Michel, of course, it's over to you now. What do you say to these countries who are knocking on Europe's door, Ukraine, Moldavia, and Georgia? First of all, as we've all seen through the other interventions, this war that Russia started against Ukraine has brought the European Union and the European leaders to suddenly become clear-sighted about the situation and to carry out an analysis of their weaknesses and to become more robust and solid. And this is why President Michel has absolutely right to say one of the key questions that is being asked again is the question of the enlargement of the European Union. What will be the borders of the EU tomorrow? And this is a debate that is difficult because within the 27 member states, there are different feelings and impressions about this strategic question of what the borders of the European Union space should be. When we look at our neighboring countries, I think there are a number of countries who are destined one day, I hope some of them, I hope it will be very quickly, I hope that they will become members of the European Union. And there are other countries where we are destined to develop strategic partnerships and strong relations in the area of economic cooperation and investment and security and energy. And so this means that they will become a member of the European Union Club. It depends partly on them and partly on us, because we have to agree that we want to carry on with this enlargement. And this is why Salomé Zourabichvili is quite right to raise this question of enlargement. Two points about this. To go further with enlargement, first of all, we have to be clear about which countries want to join us. If the states actually want to join us, and they're sincere, they have to carry out structural reforms to be able to share European standards, to share the same legal regime, no discrimination, elimination of corruption, democratic reforms, the freedom of the press, all of these things which are the shared heart of European values. And that's why we're very clear with these governments and states saying that they have to carry out this reform process. But we also, in the European Union, we have our own duty to carry out in this area. And this is something that will begin in the European Council soon. What will be the future of Europe? What is our strategy for the Europe? Because if tomorrow we have more than 30 member states, this has impacts on three subjects. First of all, how do we make decisions together? Even today with 27, there are a lot of different pressures and debates about the right to veto, which is used very often by certain countries, too often perhaps. Then we have a qualified majority in some cases. How do we organize the decision-making process and the deliberation process? And we have to seek this democratic legitimacy, which is central to our European project. Secondly, what do we want to do together? What are the common policies of the European Union? Cohesion, historically, traditionally, has been one. Agriculture is important, and that's the case in France too. What will be the case if tomorrow we have countries bringing tens of millions of additional citizens, and we have to look at the issues of cohesion and agriculture and other common policies? And thirdly, the financing and solidarity. Every time we have a European budget, we can see that spontaneously there's not the same response and reaction in terms of the assets, and it should be put in the common pool. We have a few months to make everything clear in this area. We have to have political democratic deliberation, not just by the elites in Brussels. All of the governments and the parliaments, the national parliaments, have to be involved to enrich this debate, so that I hope in the next few months the choices will be made. I'd like to end by saying that it's true, Caucasia and Central Asia are areas that we have to be interested in. We have to look at that. If we're not mobilized to politically engage, even if these countries don't share exactly the same standards and the same principles as we envisage them in terms of institutions, there are many reasons why we should not leave a vacuum for others to be able to intervene and impose their way of seeing the world. There's a lot. It's very important to have a stable Europe, for us to work with countries in Central Asia or with the countries of Caucasia, such as Armenia, Azerbaijan. So you can see we're very